morning, everyone, and my apologies. My voice is, I have I think, a little cold. That was a fantastic presentation, Jacobo, and a fantastic foundation to build on. Why I chose this title, I don't know if you had the same experience when you were small children. I grew up in Australia, and so if we went on holidays, everything was a long distance. And I remember we would get in the car, and we would be in the car for, I don't know, 15 minutes, you know, and we were going to drive 1,000 kilometers. And my sister and I would say, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And for the next 10 hours, we would be constantly saying, you know, "Are we there yet?" And it was very helpful to see this timeline that Jacobo shared with us, because I'm not sure that we are there, but I think we're as close as we've been for a very long time. And I think there are many signs that we've been looking for that things are now finally starting to come together. And with that progress and that positive movement on this continuum, we have a whole range of new challenges and decisions to make along the way. Just very quickly, Robert, I'm just thinking, I don't know, was it maybe 2016, 2017? We have known each other quite some time. So just very quickly, I started the company in Australia, but we're also based here in Europe. And we provide enterprise tools to enable our partners, typically financial institutions, government, telco, to give their customers the ability to access, control, and exchange their personal data. So we really focus on the APIs, and again, picking up on some of the great questions that have just come from the audience, is we see that one of the things that is going to be really critical over the next year or two while some of these decisions are being made is this chicken and egg. Should an organization move forward and get started, or do they wait for all the decisions? And so we think that there will be a demand for this infrastructure, and we want to be able to make sure that it's as simple as possible and out of the box when those decisions start to be made. But let's just step back for a moment, because this last 12 or 18 months has been a little bit tricky. I'm thinking of when we were all together a year ago. If I look around the audience, there's been quite a bit of change just with some of the people that I know here and in other parts of the world. It's been a really tough capital market. There's been consolidation with large identity access management organizations. There's been acquisitions. There have been some organizations that have fallen by the wayside. There are some dear colleagues in this room that have moved from one industry leader to another. And so we've seen quite a lot of change. And I think it's worth sharing a few things from Liminal, the advisory group in the United States, to say that this last year, particularly in the US, we've seen a lot of layoffs in the tech sector. They started to look at what vendors were looking for with reduced costs, with wanting to try and meet the demands of customer expectation, but also lower onboarding, is that they think that at the moment about 50% of enterprises still rely on 4 or more point solutions to service a single use case. So we've still got a way to go in terms of being able to make that, maybe it's beginning to feel more seamless for the customer on the front end, but there's still quite a work that needs to be done at the back end. And with some of these decisions, like these 45 or whatever decisions that need to be made around the standardization or how things will be implemented, what we would hope is that if you are using multiple systems, there is some element of plug and play. Still, despite the fact that it's been a really rocky 12 months, 18 months, Liminal is still kind of bullish on the value of this reusable market. And again, we may see that still slow over the next 2 years while the European wallet is taking shape and clarity. But we're looking out over the next few years of a market of net new value. They're estimating around 245 billion euros. And where we're seeing some of that work, first of all, obviously here in Europe, we're seeing it from government. We're seeing it from financial service providers in various jurisdictions. I was back in Australia a month or so ago, and Connect ID, which is a spin-out of FPOS, which provides the debit payment infrastructure in Australia, after lots of cajoling and encouragement, They've finally got the 4 major banks on side to be part of this network scheme, and 2 of the big banks made their announcements just a few weeks ago to enable customers to start having more of this choose their identity and this portability. So in Australia, we have a regulation called the Consumer Data Rights. It's a little bit like GDPR. It's a little bit like some of the stuff that we're trying to do around identity. It's probably not as sophisticated, but there are many jurisdictions, and again, as Jacoba said, I wouldn't be surprised that we find certain jurisdictions wanting to align as quickly as possible to enable cross-border. So the challenge ahead for us is, particularly now that we're moving more into spatial web, is these software-defined realities. And again, this continuous authentication. How do you really know that you're dealing with a person or an avatar on behalf of a real identity? How do we make sure that we are adhering to the privacy, the security, and how are we kind of wiring these things for trust? Here over the last few years, and certainly this year, we've seen so many of these new regulations or acts finally be published. This is not exhaustive, but some of the things that do impact identity: the Digital Markets Act, the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, and also the establishment of the 9 data spaces to try and create this single unified digital market here in the EU, all folding out of the EU data strategy. What's great about that is there's starting to be some clarity, but it's also fair to say that it can be very confusing to try and harmonise these different regulations and land on a sweet spot that aligns across all of these. Jumping specifically into Europe, part of what was behind the move to the wallet was this idea that you could enhance trust and create this voluntary data sharing market for the benefit of business and citizens. I love that beacon on the hill, but again, I would agree with Jacoba that I think that in the short term, until some of these risks and who's liable, until these things are sorted out, we may see these closed loop ecosystems. So you may find a financial services organisation that already has B2B relationships where they're already prepared because they're actually part of those use cases to manage some of that risk. They may interact with the EU wallet, but they may not be so comfortable in making all their attestations, all their attributes, all that data open to a larger use case, ecosystem. So I think we may either see industry sector or use case led in the short term. And then just specifically, the idea is that as residents and citizens and businesses will have this, and this is going to allow interaction between wallets. And so this is really interesting. That's very easy to say. Interaction between. What does that mean? Is that plug and play? Is that, what's the interoperability? And when we start to think of the promise of this, by 2030, this is very exciting, but we've got to have a form factor that will allow us to issue, prove, store, access, track, revoke, and be embedded in the life management, the digital life management of a citizen, of a resident as part of their normal digital day, and at the same time exercise increased human agency. So it's no small feat what we're expecting to happen in a very fast period of time. Again, I won't go into this because there are too many great sessions later in the day that are dedicated to these topics. But one thing that I would build on is that we have what's happening with the IDES and the EU wallet. Jacoba has already mentioned the Open Wallet Foundation. Google are already very active in that. It's interesting to see what happens with Apple. The reason the keys are here is that, that's the question in terms of security, key management, who's in control, and John Eric and I were talking just before the session in terms of we care, we're identity nerds, we really love that this is happening, but what about the average person in the street? And the reality is, and this is really the challenge to us, is the minute Google or Apple make it simple and sexy, that's really what starts to drive adoption. So there is real work to do. But, can I have this shiny government thing, or can I have this thing that automatically just works and it's already on my phone and I just need to do 2 taps? And so I think we're maybe underestimating the user experience and the challenges that are going to be associated with that. And particularly to go back to the slide in terms of the data spaces, it's all well and good to be saying that we want to share data across these industry sectors. But in any industry sector, whether it's medical or mobility or Green Deal or agriculture, there's always a farmer, there's a citizen, there's a patient, there's a student, there's an employee. So we can't get away from the fact that we also need to have this data space of interoperability to allow people to move in, various roles they have, their professional roles, their family roles, their roles as citizens. What's different now compared to a year ago, as demonstrated by the opening video, is we're now fusing more this physical and digital. So we're now moving into this much more immersive, collaborative and experiential technology. I mean, I like to think that there was that old adage that software's eating the world. I think now we're starting to live inside the software. So we've got very different kind of challenges. And again, with identity, what is identity? I mean, we could hold days and days and days to try and come up with what the answer to that question. But I think increasingly identity is becoming context. So as we connect everything, our physical, our digital twins, we increase the generation of data, the identity considerations, everything becomes identity. And again, we've already touched on, whether that's the way I sound or move, or, I have a little bit of a cold today, but is there still something that uniquely identifies me that either can help or harm me if somebody is trying to act on my behalf in a fraudulent way. And there's an interesting podcast that I would encourage you to listen to from Ezra Klein, the hard fork from New York Times, and he's saying one of the challenges as we move into spatial web is that we don't necessarily have the governance mechanisms in place. We haven't worked out some of these things yet to navigate through this. And if you want an example of that, just if we look at what's happened with OpenAI and the governance and over the last couple of weeks of, one of the most valuable companies in the world doesn't have a CEO, does have a CEO. We are making up some of these things as we go along. And then, of course, I don't think this is ever going to go away, but the issue of privacy and individual rights, and I think some of the concerns for the EU wallet and some of the security decisions that have been raised in the trilogue, I think that they'll be covered later today as well. So if we want privacy and we want to be able to act independently, we also need to be able to anchor trust in the way we transfer between the physical and the digital, that this is an avatar that can be linked back to a real person. So particularly with the rise of AI and, again, the amount of fraud, this is really tough. This is really tough. Is our obligation to minimize privacy, to maximize the protection of someone? Or is it to say, oh no, privacy trumps all, and if you get into trouble, you get into trouble, but at least you're free? So I think, as professionals, these are some of the difficult choices we're going to need to make. And again, as we're moving into spatial computing, this fusing of the physical with the digital, and now we're going to add AI. So if we just look at some of the things that have changed in the last 12 months, I mean, I can't remember whether we were talking about ChatGPT last year. If we were, I mean, it was really early days, and show of hands, has anyone that hasn't used DALL-E or ChatGPT it's just pulling out my credit card the other day to create a presentation. It's like, will I go looking for something, or will I generate something completely original? Here's $15, add it to the credit card. It wasn't even a conversation we were having a year ago. So one of the things that we will see more and more and more, this identity as context, but it also means that we'll be able to uniquely identify or potentially assign some kind of value to everything, to every fractional transaction. That could be monetary value, that could be loyalty, that could be carbon offset. So we're moving into a very different economic models as well that can be enabled if we can get this identity piece right. However, we will want to know, again, I think it's interesting, this session that will be later today on who or what am I? You know, am I a legal entity? Can I attach this to a person that can be trusted? I don't need to necessarily know the name of that person, or that person doesn't need to announce themselves. But if something goes wrong, I need to be able to know that there is some accountability. And again, another ambition for the EU by 2030 is this digital product passport. So we're able to see the entire supply chain in the same way we see a nutrition label, and to understand the inputs to that. So there's a whole raft of possibility here, just focusing on the creation of these passports and supply chain management. But increasingly, it's becoming very difficult because I certainly now, anything that I see in social media, my first assumption is it's probably not correct. Who is the journalist? Which newspaper, or, you know, did Reuters, have they published this? What's the likelihood of it being fact-checked? If I see a video, I don't think for a second that that's necessarily the video, that it hasn't been altered in some way. And again, this quality of AI-generated content is just it's just speeding up so quickly. And so how can we move seamlessly and use identities and assets between these physical and digital if we don't embed some sort of trust? And I don't know necessarily what those answers are. There's work going on in kind of watermarking or being required to acknowledge whether or not something has been altered. But again, we're nerds, we care about this stuff. I check those things. You know, most people that jump onto the bus or train in the morning and they're flicking through the newspaper or social media, they're not looking for those cues. It's that emotional engagement immediately. And without spending too much time on what's happened with ChatGPT, again, this was before all of the changes over the last weeks. But there was already a concern. I think this may have, I can't remember if this came directly from Sam Altman, but just this idea that we're already pouring gasoline on an already well-lit fire. You know, this is, I mean, it's just extraordinary when I think of what I might see in the next decades of my life in terms of this fusion of us between our physicality. I was listening to an interesting podcast this morning on the way here, around the evolution of us into machines, biomechanics, limb replacement, gene editing, AI inside physical things that will be inside our bodies. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, and they're things that are happening today. This is not science fiction. What's also interesting is this is an interesting experiment. If you would have a look at this, this was between, I think, Google and Stanford. So they created this little experiment called Smallville, where they gave some AI agents sort of a backstory. You know, you're the mayor of a town, you know, you do this, you do this. So they gave these agents a little bit of their own personal backstory, and then let the agents start to interact with each other. And within a very short period of time, the agents were gossiping about each other. They were talking about whether or not so-and-so should run for town mayor and reporting misdemeanors. And so that's what happens when we let a simulation run wild. And I'm really calling this out more for our responsibility to young people and an emerging generation, this amplification of social inequality, discrimination and harms. You know, we can't underestimate a responsibility, because I know we're going to be working some things out over this next decade, but the likely impact more and more is to a younger generation. So I think where we're going to end up, I'm not sure how we're going to get there. I don't think it'll be a straight line, but we will end up with provenance being embedded in everything. And again, some aspect of identity just as a fabric, a foundation in absolutely everything we do. So we will need new tools, we'll need new workflows for managing the verification and revocation, even if that's something that's done in a microsecond. And again, I think we've made a lot of progress over the last 2 or 3 years in the credentialing space, but whether these will be machine-to-machine credentials or whether they'll be presented via the wallet or whether they'll be part of an onboarding, we've got to get this balance right, along with the ability to exercise some control and for citizens, customers, patients, employees to give meaningful consent. Because when you start to think about the number of times during the day we may be pinged by something or we may have to approve something, just this onslaught of consent, that's not going to work. That's going to create fatigue. And we know then what happens is people typically say yes. Which brings us in some ways full circle back then to the custodial. Don't worry about it. You don't need to say consent. Give us the responsibility. We'll hold the keys and we'll make those decisions on your behalf. And I think we will see services emerge where you make up maybe some of your privacy rules or you come up with your deal breakers, and then there'll be services that sort of mediate on your behalf. But this issue of who controls the keys and whether or not the decision of what's ethical or what's safe or what's secure may be decided by that service provider. I think this is going to be a very interesting frontier. Obviously, this next generation of digital kids are going to grow up with digital keys in the way that we grew up with physical keys, but I think still there's going to be complexity. So just in bringing all of those things together, this next wave of identity, I'd just like to look at very quickly the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats. I think the strength by far in terms of, are these the signs we're looking for, is we've got regulation here in the European Union that is talking about decentralization. That's a very big shift. I remember being part of those working groups with Christopher Allen back in 2016, and it seemed like we had a dream that would be impossible to fulfill. So we have come a long way. In terms of weaknesses, I think we can't underestimate this issue in terms of balancing privacy and security. That is going to be an ongoing battle challenge for us to meet on a daily basis because, as I said, if we give too much autonomy in terms of privacy, then we may be putting people in harm's way from a security point of view. And if we're treating people as if they can't make those decisions and things are very secure, then we may find ourselves making kind of surveillance decisions. So I really do think that this is a weakness that we must be aware of in terms of the way we design anything. In terms of opportunities, that would be a whole other session. That would be days. The opportunities are in everything. They're in our physical world. They're in the metaverse. They are in products and services. They are in transport. Literally everything as a result of this trajectory we're on right now is going to begin to transform in some meaningful way. So there is no shortage. However, as Mariana asked in the last session as a question, use cases, starting somewhere concrete where you can demonstrate value for ecosystem members, for the end employee, customer, student, patient. Concrete examples is really the critical. And then last but not least, in terms of threats, digital rights. I know that what happened in the trilogue around the EU wallet, this issue, some changes on security. Now, what does that mean? I was at Convergence in Brussels on Friday, and there was a panel discussing the change, and there was differences of opinions between, but the EU wouldn't do the wrong thing. Yes, it might be able to, but it wouldn't. And then there was an argument to say, but are all member states equal in terms of their perspective on human rights, digital rights, the autonomy? So I think alongside privacy and security, this is something that we will have to elevate in the design of systems. And then importantly, this is very exciting where things are moving from a technology point of view. And technology alone doesn't change the world. It can. I mean, if we make all our decisions just based on what technology can do, I think that we will have some existential challenges as a society, because if we're not keeping pace with the social contracts, and I know we're trying to do that with regulation, but it generally lags, these are the kinds of decisions as architects that we need to be in a room working with an enterprise and thinking, is this what I would like my child or my grandchild to be, in this ecosystem? What are the decisions that I want to see enabled through this technology or this scheme or this governance that would make me feel comfortable about sleeping at night? So I think, that responsibility as these things are being worked out really does come back to us. So back in the car with mum and dad, about to drive 1,000 kilometers. I think this is the signs we've been looking for. I don't think we're there yet, but I think when you think about the things that have been presented in the timeline just over this last decade, we've made a lot of progress. There's a way to go, but I think these are the signs that we're looking for. Thank you.
So thank you, Katryna. People recognize the sign you've been looking for. Yeah, you also were sitting in the car, and I think I remember when I was driving to Spain, and then you're coming to Lyon, and then Lyon, you can always choose the 2-1 going to the city or around the city. And we also had a debate about this. So, any questions to Katryna? Yeah, John Erik?
Hey, thank you for a very good presentation as always, Katryna. And I think that last sentence you had, we also need a social contract. I think it's really important. I mean, you and I and the rest of us, we talk about trust. We're building a trust framework. We have an understanding of what that means by, chain of trust and trust anchors and so on. But for people, trust is emotional.
Yeah.
We can't decide, trust this, right? We need to build that. And what are we as a community doing in that respect? How are we? I mean, you already hear, this is just to, so the government will know everything I do, right? How do we handle those challenges with people?
I think the problem is that, again, as professionals, we're discussing that every day, but it's not dinner table conversation. It's not necessarily the conversation that parents have with their kids. Maybe more so because of what's happening with things like cyberbullying and some of the impacts with children having a lot of time digitally. Families are starting to talk about, but they tend to talk about that from a protection point of view or trying to limit. What we're not having necessarily are those conversations around the social contract, because we could either have technology define what those social contracts are going to be, or, which is happening in some parts of the world. I mean, if you look at China in terms of a lot of the convenience that has been enabled by a data-driven society, that's because the government has already determined what those social contracts are. Those rules have been written, so it's very easy to execute the technology because that is there. But if we don't do it the other way, if we don't decide what those social contracts, where those limits are, then particularly with how things are moving so fast with AI, I'm probably a little more pessimistic that we will have to, that those conversations will evolve in the rear vision mirror because things have moved too quickly and we've got unintended consequences.
Right, so the answer is a totalitarian state.
I don't know that I'm that pessimistic, but I think I am at a stage of life where I think all the best years, the halcyon days are behind me. I think the next decades ahead will be very interesting. Yeah? We will wrestle with things that we've not had to do collectively before, yeah, in such a cohesive way.
Hi, Katryna. Hi.
Hello.
It was a great presentation. I have a question just to follow up on. Will there be any situation in future where we can ever be off the grid? We can live without, being without the identity or live by ourselves.
I find it very hard to imagine. There may be some cultures that are already deep in the Amazon that will be able to preserve that. But I think this is why some of these foundational decisions are so critical, because it's very hard today if you're enrolled in school or your first birth record now is going to be something digital in a hospital. So I think before you're even at an age of having any agency, you have school records, you have medical records, you have travel records, you may have a frequent flyer number. So I think this idea that you can operate outside of this digital infrastructure, I think is highly unlikely. Certainly in the developed world or developing countries. And then even if you're deep, deep, deep in the Amazon, what is happening with satellite technology and the way we're mapping the world, maybe that tribe won't know about us, but I can guarantee we probably know about them. So I think it will be almost impossible, yeah? Unless there is some cataclysmic event and there's no electricity.
Hey, good morning, Boris Gardner. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I really loved it. So I really want to press you on this. So what is, following up on your question, what is your vision on the best way forward? What would that social contract look like?
I used
to contrast that to our friend in China.
So before I started Meeco, I worked in large banks, financial institutions, and often around compliance and the design of products. And we used to have this question that we would ask ourselves when we were designing a financial product. Would we be comfortable if someone sold this product to our mother? Yeah? So it was really simple. So if it was an insurance product or it was a mortgage product or if it had complexity and maybe it was very easy to obfuscate something, would I want somebody knocking on the door or calling up and selling this product to my mother? I can't tell you the number of times that question helped change the nature of that product discussion. It took the sting out of the room. It helped connect the pragmatists with the dreamers in terms of we all agreed we didn't want our mother buying a product that wouldn't deliver, would be expensive, and wouldn't have the cover that we were expecting. Maybe that's still a good question. But I think if we maybe start to think about, this child born today that has no choice, and by the time they have the digital agency, have we designed systems? Are we putting that digital child in the product decisions that we're making that are all very easy to do from a pragmatic point of view? But is this something that we would like maybe our great-great-grandchild to be using? And what's the social contract that we're enabling for that to happen? We might not come up with the answers, but I think it's a very good question.
Oh, great. Good closure of this session. So, applause for Katryna.